what I'd like to do now is taking Stephen's fabulous introduction and use it as in your working memory workspace to go a little bit further down into some of the details to think about what I think are points that are important for a conference on measurement and how we're making these measurements of borderline states of consciousness, and to really point out, I think, some important things for both the scientific and the philosophical discussion that I'm imagining we're going to have over the next 2 days. So I've divided my talk into 2 parts. The first part is to talk about rationalizing the discourse through meaningful categorizations. So we've heard about the categorizations, and they are as they were presented, but I want to show you a few other things about them. And one of the important things is I think there are some category errors, or at least there's one important category error, and we can talk about what that is in a moment. But also to push a little further into aligning our measurements with conceptual and clinical models for each of these disorders of consciousness. And then really the second part of this talk is to expose and address what are the most interesting things for the topic that we have here, which is the difficult middle in these novel measurements and what that's starting to look like and show us. And I'll explain what I mean by the difficult middle. But here I want to push on advancing connections between biological models and available measurement tools, so the fMRI and EEG that you've had introduced to you, and talk about interpretive ambiguities and their meaning for understanding consciousness in the injured brain and how it recovers, although I'll say very little about that in the time we have. But also this issue of how do we interpret intermediate results and move away from what are often false and unhelpful dichotomies, not so much in our literature, because if people read our papers, I think you'll see that there's a lot of understanding of the ambiguity and the interpretive limitations of these tools. But the translation into the popular press and maybe into philosophy, I don't know, because I don't know how much of this is making its way into philosophy, often gets strictly dichotomized. And I think this is where, as this group kind of shares ideas and understandings and discussions, we have some opportunity to do some interesting work and move forward. So let me start with the categories. So I'm going to begin, and Stephen and I did not coordinate any of this, but I'm going to start with the 1D view, which comes out of a paper, the same review paper that Stephen pointed out in Neuroimage, which points out that in the early days here, meaning the 1970s to 1990s, because basically most of this wasn't an issue up until the 1970s or late 60s, because people just died. The only reason that we have a field of disorders of consciousness is because we had ICUs develop in the 60s. And the first thing that was recognized was that, well, there was coma, and there was something called coma dépassé, which was basically brain death. And it only existed because people were on ventilators and they didn't die because their hearts and lungs were being supported. And then it took about 15, 20 years before Brian Jeanette, Fred Plum published their paper in The Lancet in 1972, defining the persistent vegetative state as a syndrome, as Stephen pointed out, where patients open their eyes and close their eyes, but they're otherwise comatose. And then that was really the sum total of what you could find in the literature if you go back, were these 3 terms: coma, vegetative state, or persistent vegetative state, and brain death. And anything that kind of was severe disability, but clearly somebody showed consciousness, was discussed or presented as if it was essentially functionally approximating persistent vegetative state. Now, fast forward, and Stephen just gave you these definitions, we have a series of distinctions. Now, for the last 15 years, Stephen and I have been presenting complementary 2-dimensional views, but the only way to get at this is in a 2-dimensional view. So here's the New York version, you're sitting in the Liège version. And the axes are different. Okay, so now let me orient you to this 2D diagram because it's going to show up throughout the talk. We're not looking at the contents and the levels of awareness by state, but now we're looking at measurement of cognitive function and motor function. So normal cognitive function is up here in the upper right, and a complete loss of cognitive function is below this dotted blue line, and a complete loss of motor function is below this dotted orange line. So coma and vegetative state are in the category of no motor function and no cognitive function as we can measure them. So this diagram is to organize our thinking about measurement, because this is ultimately what we do is we make measurements and then we try to interpret them. And there's an important point here right away, which is that if you're below this dotted orange line, ultimately you really don't know if somebody's opening their eyes at periods of the time of the day, whether they're in vegetative state or over here in this category, which is not locked in state, but complete locked in state. Now, the only real codification of complete locked in state at this point is in the study of patients with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis who at some point were conscious and able to communicate accurately, and then as the disease progresses, they slip below the line where that's possible. Assaying their consciousness, assaying the contents of their consciousness, or knowing how conscious they are, is unknown. That's a limitation right now. We don't have a way of doing that. Ultimately, we don't have a way of gauging the subjective experience in this space under the interrupted orange line. There's no demographic implication by the size of this. This is just so you can see what's going on. The separation between the yellow interrupted line, where there's inconsistent motor function, sets the hard boundary usually between minimally conscious state. And this really is goal-directed motor function, if you want to interpret why there's nothing above minimally conscious state. And then there should be another bright line here, but Science Translational Medicine didn't add it, and I forgot to put it into this version, which is the distinction between minimally conscious state and the next level over, which is something called confusional state. And this distinction is reliable and consistent communication. But reliable and consistent communication is a problem not just for patients in minimally conscious state, but for anybody in between these two lines, because we can't judge them to be operationally distinct from minimally conscious state, even though they also may be like complete locked-in state patients. So this is going to be the theme that I enlarge on as I go through the measurements and try to lay out for you why, these are like kind of big issues. Now, there's sort of there are roughly two problems in the subfield that are being studied, and I think the most important one, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on at this conference because it's not the most interesting and important measurement problem yet. It's certainly not the one that directs itself to the issues that philosophers are interested in terms of consciousness. But the biggest problem in terms of its demographic and its societal impact is understanding the mechanism of recovery from coma to full consciousness and how we measure not just the operational improvements in cognitive function and awareness, but just we understand the mechanisms underlying this process in the brain. A related but distinct problem is the one in which we have people who are in this box, but we can identify that they can communicate and are fully conscious. And when it comes down to it, and this is the other reason to put the two d-axes as I've put them, now you can't see it very well, but we have quantitative, graded, metrical ways of measuring behavioral response, starting over here using, in this range, from coma to the outer limit of minimally conscious state, the coma recovery scale revised that Stephen showed you. In this range in between of what's called the confusional state, between emergence from minimally conscious state and the wide range of normal to impaired function captured by standard neuropsychological batteries, something called the confusion assessment protocol. Now, what does this contain? It contains items of orientation and situational awareness and things like, am I touching my nose? Were you born in New York? Is it March right now? Something like that. There's a way of operationally laying out distinctions and gradations of cognitive function and awareness, et cetera, but we only can measure them in this area, above this interrupted yellow line over here. So now that sets some limitations on really even starting to get at what might be the contents of subjective awareness and consciousness anywhere in minimally conscious state and vegetative state. And it allows us, however, the opportunity to create a whole battery of measurements in these ranges of function that then we can compare to help us sort out who might be down here versus over here below the orange line. Now, so that, and that's, I think, it's this red to green line that we're talking about mostly in this conference, which is how do we get to the point where our measures don't just tell us maybe somebody's like locked in and can communicate versus they have no response at all, but how do we start to deal with the measurement and the interpretation of this difficult middle? This is going to be the difficult middle. Okay, so let's move forward. So with this conceptual structure in mind, I spent a lot of time on that, but I wanted to kind of set up my talk and then we'll go faster. I believe our categories should be sharply defined because measurement always wins when measurement is more precise. And we're getting to the point now where we have a lot of different tools and they overlap in interesting ways, and there's a lot of flexibility in doing this. So we should use all the information we have, and we should try to fill in as much of this as we can. we should also expect that there's a convergence of clinical data and the results of these sophisticated measurements iteratively as we go forward. And this is starting to happen. Stephen showed you a very important slide, which I'm going to repeat, and I'll show you some new work that's coming out from Peter Forgatz, who's in the audience, and some other things. But I think, you know, we're going to see that we're going to start to, in this period of time, start to get evidence that kind of is reinforcing and going, oh, this is kind of the picture, and then, you know, let's start to build it out. And then finally, not just correlating clinical data and what we find when we do interesting things with fMRI or EEG, we're going to move toward biological models that underpin our understanding of each of these distinct categories. And in this context, you know, I really want to start with the most provocative thing I might say for a philosophical audience, is that, you know, this idea of command following in the vegetative state really should be seen as a category error, right? A category mistake or a category error is a semantic or ontological error in which things belonging to a particular category are presented as if they belong to a different category, or alternatively, a property is ascribed to a thing that could not possibly have that property. And now, I think this is really important. Particularly, I love every newspaper reporter who writes an article on this to bear this in mind and think about how they might frame all of this information so that people could understand it. But we're going to go into this. So let's do a warm-up exercise before we get to this idea that covert cognition in the vegetative state is a category error. And let's talk about the refinement of brain death criteria, because I think this is a very transparent and clear example of what's going to happen now in vegetative state, all right? So brain death criteria are mostly clinical, all right? And the way that, and this sort of is illustrating how you do it. You have to apply painful stimuli below and above the neck. And the reason for that is that somebody could have a spinal cord transection, and testing whether they respond to painful stimuli if they don't have if they have an interruption of the nerves going to the brain isn't very useful. So you always stimulate the supraorbital ridge, which is right underneath the eye and very painful, to test if they have brainstem sensory function. And then you have to test systematically all the brainstem nerves. But it's well known that, you know, there are situations that people have trauma, there are reasons why they might have had an eye surgery. You might not be able to systematically and comprehensively assess all of those nerves accurately because of confounds. So then there's one more thing that's done clinically, and that's, since everybody's on a ventilator, because if you're brain dead, you can't run your body, you can't run your heart or your lungs, you do an apnea test. And an apnea test basically is they take you off the ventilator, and as the partial pressure of your CO2 rises, if you don't drive your ventilation, then the assumption is that a negative result on all of these things should 100% of the time, invariably, and without, you know, any error, associate with what Stephen showed you before, an empty skull sign. No activity in the brain. Now, if everybody who was brain dead got an FDG PET study, we could be fine. We know we'd never make an error. But this is expensive and impractical and not available. But there's a ground truth linking the measurement to the biological model to the clinical assessment. And that's how brain death has evolved as a criterion. That's why most people are very confident with the idea that you can lawfully associate total loss of brain cellular function with these clinical criteria. But there are always going to be situations where you miss something or somebody did something wrong. And so when you read about the McMath case in California and everybody davening over, is this patient brain dead or not? Well, maybe they're not. Maybe there's an error. Maybe there's some piece of brain that's still functioning. There's lots of examples of this in the literature. But the other thing to remember is what distance, what metrical distance is this patient going to be from this picture? Not very much. Okay? So then let's go back and say, well, if that's the case, what about the biological model for vegetative state? Does the biological model or the conceptual model for vegetative state make any sense with people imagining playing tennis? Clearly, it does not. So, how do we go at that and try to bring concordance to clinical assessment of vegetative state, the conceptual model of vegetative state, and learning about these people who actually can do this? So Peter Forgatz is in the audience, and our team have been, you know, working for years on this, and this is a sample we just started publishing. It's out on, you can find it on the web now. It's published in Annals of Neurology. It doesn't have a tag yet because it's not actually a real paper in a printed journal. But this is a retrospective analysis that Peter did of nearly 2,500 hours of continuous EEG recording in 44 subjects who we studied in one center. A majority of them had fMRI tests for command following. Some of those had tests for communication. I'll talk about that later. and also a majority of them had FDG studies as well. And in this paper, we found 4 patients who were able to follow mental imagery commands in fMRI and verify that they could do that. So this is the first study that is based on a database that really allows for a direct correlation between conventional EEG measures, the ones that are used clinically in any hospital in the world that you can go get anybody to read and pay for right now, and these investigational assessments. And I think these findings are going to have implications for the risk of what we should be thinking of as a misidentification of vegetative state. Somebody comes in and they can play tennis. It's a misidentification of vegetative state. Now, these are the 4 subjects, and there are a couple things to point out. Now, they all could do fMRI tennis playing, and they verified this in various ways. But the other thing is they all had highly preserved cerebral metabolic activity in their PET studies, as you can see here. Yet, every single one of them, at some point for a long period of time, was judged as vegetative. 2 of them were assessed as vegetative on our first assessments when they came to our clinical center by us. And you got to understand that when you read the Monty paper and you read the Owen paper, it's the same story. Now, the Owen patient was judged as vegetative, but then after time they re-examined the patient, they found something consistent with minimally conscious state. 2 of the Monty vegetative patients, while they were in the research study, if you read the paper, were identified as minimally conscious. You know, it doesn't really tell you anything about the test other than, you know, we know about 40% of the patients, as Stephen pointed out, just don't get diagnosed as minimally conscious if they're and appear vegetative if they have very limited motor channels, because it's just hard. And you have to have a prior. But this is the kind of thing that can give you a prior. Now, what did Peter find, just to say? So he found that if you apply the standard approach to just sort of looking at the organization of patterns of the EEG and wakefulness, that there was a very lawful progression of improvement in function in the overall pattern of the EEG that correlated more or less roughly with the diagnosis by the standard measure, the coma recovery scale, or the sort of clinical diagnoses. And that the 4 patients who showed that evidence of fMRI command following all basically had normal or only mildly abnormal EEG wakeful backgrounds. So that's something that's not hard to do. If you have a patient who you're concerned about being in the vegetative, not really being in the vegetative state, and they have a doctor, you go tell the doctor to go get a standard EEG. If they have a normal EEG, the risk is going to be higher. It doesn't mean that they're going to be able to follow commands or do any of this stuff, but it means that there's a big risk. Potentially, and this correlated, as Stephen showed you, and I'll show his slide in a minute, with a cohort of patients that had the highest level of resting cerebral metabolic activity. So PET and FDG PET and EEG, basic clinical EEG, correlated well. But the other thing that was interesting is that all of them had sleep spindles and sleep-wake architecture, but they all had sleep spindles. So that's also an integrity measure of the frontal systems. So in the aggregate, you know, these are very simple, very straightforward, completely vetted, normalized things. And they really support this idea that the patients who show covert command following or cognition this way are a subpopulation in the general DOC population with predominant injuries either to motor efferent or motor control areas with relative preservation of brain structures outside the motor system. They have an intact, functional, organized, dynamically normal corticothalamic system. And so every single paper that's showing you now a patient who has a, quote, normal response, you should ask yourself, well, how much of their brain is there? How active is it metabolically? And how well organized is it dynamically from an electrophysiological point of view? This is how we're going to learn about this, but this is also then how we're going to get at the more interesting stuff, where what do we do about everything in between? Because everything in between is where all the action's going to be in terms of learning about mechanisms of consciousness from disordered brains. And I'll show you the interesting stuff about that as we go on. That's the next half of the talk. I just want to go back to Stephen's paper, which I think is really important and one of the most important, things that's come out in literature recently, because this, so he shored up what, we shored up, or we just correlated with what he demonstrated, which is that FDG PET has a very strong sensitivity to MCS, because if you've got a lot of metabolic activity, you probably have a lot of corticothalamic function, and you're more likely to have a conscious integrated brain. But also, if you look within the same cohort, doing mental imagery has got incredibly poor sensitivity because you're working to sort of find this cohort of patients by throwing them all in. And if you go in the Monty paper, the most striking thing is that there are many more vegetative patients who do the fMRI command following than minimally conscious state patients. There's only 1 out of 31, and that patient was studied a month after their injury, and they basically could track with an eye. So they looked almost like vegetative, and had they not found that tracking, they would have been in the vegetative category. So it's a function of motor disability that this gets hidden. There's a dissociation there. So, and just to summarize here, these findings basically support a consistent use of available ancillary clinical measures to assess disorders of consciousness patients and calibrate them. As in, so in brain death, we came up with the apnea test. Maybe here in vegetative state we'll come up with the spot EEG for 30 minutes. But the point is that we need a first step out to say, wait, maybe this is not vegetative state. If the person's ventilating, whether their CO2 goes up, it's not brain death. We know that. And then we got to go and figure out what's going on. Using tests that have understood, well-validated variables for interpretation like FDG and EEG is a good step because they're widely used. Any center in the Western world can use them. EEG, of course, is very inexpensive, and it's thus immediately generalizable. And I've said this, or I sort of said this already, basically, that if you identify wakeful EEG architecture and sleep spindles, for example, based on Peter's results, then there's a risk that you have a misidentified vegetative or minimally conscious state patient even, and the literature supports that. And there could be better. In the case of reclassifying somebody out of vegetative state, you may then give them actual immediate opportunities for medical care or rehabilitation. And if it's in minimally conscious state, if it turns out that they might have the ability to use an augmentative communication device, then you might have a huge benefit. So back to our 2D view now. So what I've just said makes the point that really we're much better off enlarging this to 3 dimensions now. Right? Because if we enlarge to 3 dimensions and we put physiology of EEG time domain or FDG PET, we're likely to, on this axis, start to see, as we correlate with measures in patients above the interrupted yellow line, that people who follow commands in fMRI and EEG are going to be somewhere out here in this range. And we have a large consortium that's putting together studies across the world. Most of the people who are here to speak today are involved in that. And I have a last slide laying out all the names. But we're going to have hopefully 500 cases in 4 years to correlate all this stuff. And my bet is going to be that when we see command following, and certainly if you see communication through augmentative methods of EEG or fMRI, if we call responsive communication here, I'll make that distinction later, that they're all going to end up somewhere out here. They're not going to be over here, where all the people who really have vegetative brains with very damaged corticothalamic systems are. And so far the data, all the data in the literature comport with this, where you can interpret it if it's been reported. Okay, so that's the first part. Now let's talk about the difficult middle of measurement, because this is where it gets super interesting and complicated and not so clear. Now, Stephen showed this beautiful study by Marcello Massimini and his group, and he'll present this later to you as well. This is a very elegant method where they shock the brain with a transcranial magnetic pulse. You get a wave. You extract wave patterns using the strategy of information compression algorithm. And then as Stephen showed you, you can separate and actually grade this metrical result, this perturbational complexity index, showing that it performs fairly lawfully from vegetative state up to locked-in state. But if you look at the numbers and you look at it carefully, what you see is that just as in the normals with non-REM sleep and anesthetic coma versus wakefulness, you get a very sharp and clear separation of these distributions. In the range of minimally conscious to locked in, things are more clustered. And then the question is, well, how are we going to, is this measure, I mean, we don't know. I think Marcello would say, I know he said before, maybe they've found some ways to go at it more detail, but it's not clear that this is the kind of measure that's going to help us kind of fan out across that range of cognitive function, and certainly, getting into things like subjectivity and what kind of conscious experience might be, happening within here. We just know that this is probably different than people out here, and certainly we don't think people down here have any. One aspect of this that I think has been outside of the discussion but is increasingly coming in, and I'll show you our best example of that in a moment, is to start to think about how we can use these tools, particularly the EEG, because EEG is very direct in terms of reflecting brain activity and brain function, to think about where the damage to the system is playing a role and where parts of the system are recruitable versus not recruitable, and thinking about how we get things like, in this example, which I think is the most transparent and immediate one, features of the shape of the EEG power spectrum related to things like the level of deafferentation of the cortex underneath the measuring electrode. So, oh, I'm sorry, this cuts off all the references, but well, this is Drover et al. From 2011, which hasn't been written up as an abstract, but the basic ideas are in this current opinion in neurobiology paper, Schiff, Novell, and Victor, 2014. If somebody's interested, I can get it for you. I realize that we're missing some of the slides, but basically the things that are known are, if you cut out all the connectivity to a patch of cortex, the shape of the power spectrum is going to give you a massive drop-off after low frequencies, usually about less than 1 hertz, although it can go out to 2 or 3 hertz, because of course some, you know, in real clinical cases like here, you may actually have some preservation. But actually this particular clinical example more or less looks like this. This is called the cortical slab, where you've lost effectively all the features of the EEG spectrum, and anything that's at a frequency above 2 or 3 hertz is 25 decibels below the DC value of the power spectrum. But as you start to reafferent cortex, you start to see different kinds of things. There's a regime that's known from slice work where you can get spontaneous oscillatory activity in the 5 to 9 hertz range just based on the membrane potentials of the cells. And then as more afferent activity comes in, you can see similar stuff, or you can see bursting in the thalamus that then creates cortical activity at higher frequencies. And then, of course, we have a understanding of what the normal profile of the EEG spectrum is. And so here are 3 examples of a vegetative state, a minimally conscious state, and a normal spectrum, which typically has a alpha peak and then some gamma and beta components. So that's an introduction to look at a very good example. I have 2 examples, one from EEG and one from MRI, that's going to show you what this difficult middle looks like. So this is a paper that Stephen and I did together with patients who respond paradoxically to Ambien, which is zolpidem as a generic drug, to show an improvement in level of function and cognition when they're given the sleeping pill. And this is a representation of the kind of quantitative behavioral data that you can collect, and this is why I showed you all these sort of separations on the graphic. This is the patient off the drug, and at their baseline, they cannot follow auditory commands, but they can turn their head to an auditory stimulus. They have some very limited visual and motor behaviors. They don't speak, but they vocalize. There's no communication system. There's no evidence of anything that could be turned into a yes-no communication system. Their eyes are open, and their total score is about 12 or 14, 13. But then on the drug, reliably, and then as you see with second doses often for more extended periods of time, they come to the top of the scale where they can do all these things. In fact, they then go into the middle range of the cap, where they're about halfway through, and they can answer questions and talk and are oriented to their personal history. And while this is cool to like look at on a graphic, maybe it's better to see the videos. But hold on, I actually should put this in a different order, but I didn't. So let me show you what happens in their EEG. So in their EEG, what you see is in the off state, it's dominated by a oscillatory peak here at 7 hertz, and this is one channel, but it's true for most of the channels in this patient's EEG. And in the first hour of getting zolpidem, this goes away, and increased power arises in this, this range from 10 to 30 hertz. What's not normal about this is you don't see an alpha rhythm, but it turns out that if you wait long enough, this is just the first hour comparison, and it's typically about an hour to hour and a half where the peak behavioral effects were shown in that graphic I just showed you, the alpha rhythm may come back in some of the channels, and there's another regime. So now we've got a patient who we're tracking through the range of the coma recovery scale into this other range of function. But to make, you know, detailed comparisons about different levels of cognition in this is not something, you know, we did beyond the grading that I showed you in the paper, but it suggests itself as a way into looking at the complexity of interactions of brain dynamics and different levels of behavior. Now, what does this really look like? I think, you know, you really should see. So here's the motor function of the patient off the drug.
What do we do with it? Use that comb for me. Show me. Use that comb for me.
So this is off the drug. You see he takes the comb in the left hand. He's got a resting tremor in the right. He was dominant in the right hand before.
Good. great, last object.
But he can use the
That's
right hand
spoon again.
left
What
hand,
do we do
right hand
with it?
spontaneously. He just doesn't take
Show
the
me how to
comb when
use it.
she gives it to him. Now it's the spoon. And that's his off-drug motor behavior. So now getting to the top of the scale on the drug, and this is an hour into the drug.
Do with that.
You see that he took it with the right hand now, which was his formerly dominant hand. And
You got
this is no
it.
longer trembling.
Perfect.
Okay, so that's an example where we could look at quantitative behavior, EEG, and a really interesting kind of rich set of changes in the brain associated with consciousness, but within the range of minimally conscious to confusional state. And how do we interpret all that? How do we understand the lawful connection between brain dynamics and why the patient can do this, at one stage or the other? Those are interesting open questions. So one more example before I close. So this is now the difficult middle of fMRI. Now, let's talk about the patients who do have command following and appear vegetative or minimally conscious. One of the other issues is, to what extent being able to show that you have mental imagery to playing tennis allows you then to infer anything about the likelihood that this person could use that signal to communicate. That Stephen showed you an example in one case where 5 out of 6 questions were used, and Adrian has a case, and he'll show it probably tomorrow, where every time they put the person in a scanner, they could communicate by asking a question, 15, 20 times. But of course, what's the biological model of that patient? Is that a patient with, basically everything normal except that they can't generate motor activity, who's stuck in there, or where are they, right? But what's the middle range? Are there patients who can do the mental imagery, motor response, command following, but can't use it to communicate? The answer is there are boatloads of them. And the literature already shows you that, but you have to look for it. So in this paper, John Barden, who is a graduate student in my lab, did the first study to really get at the difficult middle here and show these dissociations between the behavioral exam and functional magnetic resonance imaging evaluations of command following and cognition. And we had 6 patients here. 3 of these patients showed imaging evidence of command following, but only one of those, 3 of those patients, only one of those 3 patients could then show evidence of attempting to communicate using that signal. Moreover, there was a patient here who could communicate just fine, who was in confusional state, said that they were trying to do the motor imagery and we couldn't get a signal. So you start to see the variations, but it gets more interesting than that. So let's look at the data, because the data start to show you how the measurements and these models really get kind of deep. So here is the data from the patient who was able to communicate, as I'll show you later. She had a very robust command following response to tennis playing. In this case, we asked her to swim because she was a swimmer, but we validated that swimming and tennis playing and all the rest of the motor activity all activated this supplementary motor area region of interest. And analyzing her data, just restricting it to the supplementary motor area region of interest, as done in Monty and Owen studies, she passed no problem. But she also showed a very large whole brain response, with some areas, like this area in the parietal cortex, actually having the best response. This is probably better than most of our normals as a voxel reporting this task. So she had a very, very clear response. She had a severe brainstem injury that included injuries to her interlaminar thalami on both sides of her brain. And she was judged as vegetative for 2 years, and even by us, the first full day we examined her, we only discovered that she had volitional downward eye movement on the second day of the first time we met her, and that was the first evidence in over 2 years of any command following. Okay, so just to frame this. So when you hear people say, well, but they're looking at MCS patients and we're looking at patients who are truly vegetative, that's nonsense. These are all very motorically impaired patients, and even we can call them vegetative for some period of time. It just doesn't make sense to report them in the literature as vegetative, because that's perpetuating the category error, and I don't want to do that. Okay, but we did this multiple choice communication task where we showed, a Confederate showed them a playing card out of everybody else's view and out of the view of the people who did the analysis of fMRI, and then basically they were supposed to report the suit of the card and the face of the card by doing motor imagery when they heard the suit or the face in separate runs. And this is a normal control subject who just in the standard Roy here did this like with no problem, and it was easy and done simply. But when we did the study with our patient subject, whose card was the ace of spades, we got a significant result for spade in the suit, but also a significant result for club. And the result for club was stronger. Now, we knew that she had lost her visual pathway on the right side of the brain. And we thought, well, maybe, this is like visual obscuration. Maybe she's having some sort of problem resolving, the spade versus the club because they're small things. And, maybe that's what's going on. But the problem was that for face, she had one really strong, statistically clear, unambiguous response for jack, which didn't make any sense with that hypothesis because there was no way that the configuration of the card for the jack could have been confounded with vision. So we thought about this, and in the idea of why an intermediate response, well, we had the idea of visual perception, but we also thought about possible cognitive delay or changes in the actual processing of the information, or maybe delayed vascular response. And one of the things that we had noted, and then Martin Monti in his paper with Adrian Stevens showed, was that the hemodynamic response compared to the normals was different. It had sort of like a delay to it, and it was prolonged. And we used a slightly shorter time frame in our samples, and there was a serial ordering. And the serial ordering was such that had she been one slot delayed, reporting a jack of clubs would have been an ace of spades. So, with that in mind, John Barden did a new study where he used a multivariate pattern classification scheme. He took the command following response, which we knew had all these other areas that were responding and reporting, as a template. And then he used that template using multivariate pattern classification to project into the communication runs. And when he did that, he found out that there was one clear and singular response to suit. And that was only for the club, i.e. only for the one delayed. And it was at the same criterion level for the classifier as the one single unambiguous response using canonical methods was for jack. So we thought that this is actually pretty good prima facie evidence that she was accurately communicating, but not so trivial and 2 or 3 years of work by an investigative team to sort out. So another aspect of the difficult middle. But this is not the most problematic patient in this paper for this discussion. This guy is. So this patient had been judge vegetator for a full year in a nursing facility until somebody came along and said, I think this patient's following commands with their head, and got them to the point where they could, on a letterboard, spell. This patient had highly preserved metabolic activity, had a much weaker command following signal, but statistically significant one in fMRI, but had no ability to turn it into a communication signal, even though they could use head movements at the bedside to verify that their card was the jack of spades. And we did the same thing, the pattern classification modeling from this into the communication runs, and it still failed. But this patient sends us emails because he now uses an augmentative communication device, and he wanted to come back 5 years later, says, hello, going sounds really good because I can show you what I can do now. And what he could do now was write a book, communicate, tell us he wanted time on his computer and get out of the room, and complain about the delays and the slowness of his brain-computer interface devices. So this makes it, I think, another sort of global point to this discussion, and I'm done. It's only once patients can get to the point where they initiate communication that we can probe qualities of consciousness. We can have people below that box, but we got to get them out to have any idea what's going on. And this is just sort of a gloss on what every Philosophy 101 Philosophy of Mind course will tell you, is that the best starting point for thinking about consciousness is subjective conscious report, right? I mean, and asking somebody a question and getting a yes/no to it is not a subjective conscious report. And as Joe will probably talk about, you'd never get close to the kinds of things that have been advanced about fMRI, like giving consent or life-death questions, because they can't rephrase the question, which is like the first starting point. Everybody knows how difficult communication is, even when we're working with spoken language between people, if they're depressed, if they have other things. So this is a real kind of like point to have in the back of your mind. And to date, no study has shown recovery of reliable augmentative communication channel, fMRI, EEG, indwelling LFP spike system to allow for such initiation of a communication in a patient with sufficient motoric impairment to be stably consistent with a VS or MCS level of diagnosis. So our patient, who I showed you, who does not have the ability to communicate, the first one with the strong signals, still doesn't have a reliable communication channel out. So we can only call her MCS, but I don't think she's MCS. I think she's got to be closer to locked in. I think over the time in the next 4 or 5 years, when we have 500 patients, we'll be able to say that with some quantitative evidence that has more weight. And importantly, one study has actually taken 8 MCS patients who could do command following with ERP methods and demonstrated, and this is a group that works with locked-in patients, EEG, BCIs all the time, they could not bring any of them to a criterion level to allow communication. So it's not just our fMRI study that's shown this dissociation of command following communication. This has been done in the EEG literature. So that's it. Available evidence really supports that patients who can show imaging or EEG evidence of motor imagery are in a separate category. I think most likely they're closer to locked-in state. There are these generalizable implications of the work that Stephen's done, that Peter Forgetz's paper shows, for using clinical tools to aid in this assessment the way the apnea test has been advanced to be part of the clinical initial evaluation of brain death. And that for our purposes in this discussion in the next 2 days, we should think about the difficult middle of these measurements, because they really hold a lot of promise for increasing our mechanistic understanding of human consciousness, the level of preservation in any individually injured brain, and mechanisms underlying recovery of consciousness. But current studies, I think, raise a lot of interpretive ambiguities, and intermediate responses at the present don't have a good interpretation in many cases, or you have to work hard to give one. And moreover, presenting things in strict dichotomies basically tells us nothing. You know, showing examples of somebody who has no response to a new tool and then a strict correlation with a normal response is really not informative, because then, you know, unless we can find out something interesting about their biology, that they don't look like they're somebody who's fully integrative, you know, this is less interesting than it may appear at first thing. So this is my reframing of our future. And I think, you know, this is where I think we have our discussion, and I just want to thank all my collaborators in my lab and at Cornell, and point to the collaboration of many of us who are speaking here in putting together a very large database where we can start to query a whole range of these measures and ask these questions with statistical rigor and a lot of depth. And, you know, we always are happy to show a slide for the people who've given us money to do it. And that's it. Thank you.